Hello and welcome to another Yoga Dharma TV tutorial video. We're going to be discussing, having a look at the Yoga Sutras Patanjali today. Primarily this video is in support of students on attitude training courses. However, if you wish to have a look, and that's absolutely fine as well. So the first thing we look at is who was Patanjali, when maybe did he live, how was it the Yoga Sutras are such an important piece of work in the history of yoga. So Patanjali may have lived around 2000 or 2200 years ago. Commentators do vary, however that seems to be the most usual time frame Patanjali to have lived. So there are some other texts around the same time, one on Ayurveda and one on grammar, both accredited to a man called Patanjali. Some commentators think Patanjali, who wrote the Sutras, was responsible for these, others think not. So Patanjali lived around 2,200 years ago. And now he may have been real, he may not, he may just have been a myth, and there are several myths surrounding the name Patanjali. If he did live, there isn't an awful lot of recorded evidence to support that. So one of the main myths is around a famous yogi at this time called Gunika, who was aging, was a master yogi, and nearing the end of her life, and she wanted an heir to pass on the teachings of yoga to. So she was praying one day for an heir to be delivered to her. And she was standing by a river, I think, in prayer position, like Anjali Mudra, praying for an heir, and she opened her eyes at the end of her prayer, opened her hands, and sitting in her upturned hands was a tiny half fish, half man, or half boy, I guess. So this is one myth. Now, if you look at the name Patanjali, Pata can mean fallen or falling, and Anjali is the hands in prayer, or Anjali Mudra. So there is some evidence maybe that myth has some grounding. Okay, so what were the Yoga Sutras? So if Patanjali lived around 2,200 years ago, so it's reckoned the sutras are the same, although again, some commentators date the sutras quite differently. Some maybe around the Middle Ages, but some much, much older. So the sutras are a compilation of 196 aphorisms on the theory and practice of yoga. These aphorisms are quite short and terse. They don't have any punctuation or grammar, and they require a commentary to be understood. The sutras divided into 4 books. Primarily we'll be looking at the first 2 books, although we will include the second and the third and fourth book. So the first book is on contemplation or meditation, and the second book is on practice of sadhana. The third book is on manifestations of your practice, and the fourth book looks at liberation. So how can we recognize Patanjali as an authority, someone who has the credibility to teach somebody else? Well, that first statement, the first sutra in book 1, it begins with now an authoritative instruction on yoga. So if you look into that first stanza, that first sutra a little bit more deeply, it signals the start of a practice, and it's recognizing that Patanjali, through his own practice, his own learning, his own teaching, has mastered the subject and is now considered an authority to pass it on to someone else. So how can we verify, as yoga students, how can we verify that the sutras is a valid testimony, a valid text? And how can you as students, how can you recognize a teacher in the same way? So yoga gives us 3 means of doing this. It has inference, valid testimony, and direct perception. So what that means is, so inference, so quite a normal way of maybe describing inference is, if you see smoke in the distance, you can infer that there's a fire beneath it. Now there might not be, but there's a fairly good chance there's a fire beneath it. So you might have to go and discover for yourself if there is. The second means of providing evidence and truth is valid testimony. So this would be the student practicing on their own, studying the texts, and following the teachings of teachers. And the third example, direct perception, through your own study, through your own practice, you directly receive the benefits of yoga. So you then begin to understand and you begin to be able to create your own commentary on those teachings of yoga. So as a student, you can use these ways of testifying some validity yourself. So you should never just accept things on their face value. Through your own practice, through your own study, you should be able to verify this as a valid testimony yourself. Okay. Also, some commentators think that the philosophy around this time, that Patanjali wouldn't have been the only teacher around this time teaching in this manner, in this style. It may be that there was a blossoming philosophy around this time. One of the examples of this would have been that students would gather to listen to the teacher, maybe Patanjali, and Patanjali or the teacher would sit and teach students, and the students would scribble down his teachings in these short, terse statements, and then later on use them as guidance for teaching. So this was one of the first times it's recognized, maybe one of the first times that teaching was actually written down, recorded. And prior to this, usually the usual method would be for students to sit next to the teacher and just listen to them. Now we have to ask ourselves why at this point in history were students needing to write down the teachings of a teacher. Now if we look at the 4 ages of yoga, and maybe it might make a little sense. So the 4 ages of yoga are Satya Yuga, Treta Yuga, Dwapara Yuga and Kali Yuga. In the age of Satya Yuga, this is the age of truth, where men naturally had a suspended mind. So that suspended mind is a mind that you can suspend at will, and you have the ability to use it when you need it to complete a task at hand. This would have been a natural age of enlightenment when we didn't actually need any teachings. We were there ourselves. So as we move through the age of Satya Yuga into the age of Treta Yuga, this is the age of universal magnetism, where we had the ability to manifest things that we needed at will. But we would have had the emotional stability to manifest stuff that was good for us, not necessarily bright, shiny things or money. And we move into the next epoch, Dwapara Yuga. Now, some commentators say this is the era that we're in now. It's when we're emerging out of something called Kali Yuga. So Kali Yuga was the age of maybe bestiality, where mankind is only concerned with their own survival, they're fulfilling their own needs and desires, completely engulfed in the ego. And as we move out of that 4th age of Kali Yuga and we start to ascend into something called Dwapara Yuga, we start to get some idea of a higher awareness maybe. Now it could be, the yugas are cyclical. I've mentioned going from the age of enlightenment all the way down to Kali Yuga, the age of bestiality maybe, but they are cyclical. So you go from ascending or descending Satya Yuga, and you would start descending through the yugas to get to Kali Yuga. And when you get to the bottom of Kali Yuga, you will start ascending again. So some commentators say that we have gone through Kali Yuga and we're now emerging and beginning to rise through Dwapara Yuga. So it may be, this is the reason why we would have needed more instructions on yoga. So maybe this might be why the sutras would need quite a big commentary to us. But at the time they would have made sense to students, but now, as we've moved away maybe from those original teachings, we need a bit more teaching, if you like. And you could also use the Hatha Yoga Pradipika as an example. So the Hatha Yoga Pradipika emerges around the Middle Ages, and it gives us far more information on the practice of yoga. So as I say, the Yoga Sutras are divided into 4 books, and we briefly looked at the first sutra, and now then on authoritative instruction when yoga begins. And that tells us we're beginning the practice of yoga, and we're being taught by an authority, a teacher, who has mastered the subject and is not just relaying the teachings of somebody else. So the second sutra, Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha, very much sums up the rest of the Yoga Sutras and really is the practice in a nutshell. So that simple phrase, Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. So yoga, when we're talking about yoga, we're talking about concentration. We're not talking about union. So it's probably good for us to clear that up. Now, there is a commentator on Sanskrit grammar called Panini, who is said to have defined yoga in two ways. So you have yoga as union and yoga as emancipation or concentration. And the Yoga Sutras definitely comes from the school of concentration and emancipation. So, as I have said already, this is just a brief overview of the Yoga Sutras, and it is really in support of the online training for the students on our yoga courses. Now, you will have a copy of this. So this is our introduction to Yoga Sutras. There's a little bit more detail in here than I'm talking about now. And as I said, I will look a little bit at Book 3 and Book 4. We go into those probably a lot more on the meditation teacher training and the 300-hour teacher training as well. The 200-hour teacher training, which this is aimed at really, is just an overview, and we will look at things like the klishas, the yamas and the yamas in more detail on the 200-hour course in other videos. So just looking briefly at my notes on page 3, if you're following this. Book 3 begins with Disha Bandha Chitsaya Dharana, and it translates as concentration, meaning dharana, is the process of holding or fixing the mind at one object or place. Now, we have already discussed that earlier on. Book 3 is essentially about the manifestations of your practice, and it talks about certain magical powers that you might accrue through the practice of yoga. And it also says that you shouldn't ever attach yourself to those magical powers. You should just accept them and move on. We look at more in that Book 3 in meditation teacher training really. And if we look at Book 4, it's a book on liberation, and it details the construction of the mind and how it can obscure our true nature. And again, I think that's for a deeper study, which we look at more on the 300-hour teacher training. Okay, so this is just a brief overview, as I say, in support of our 200-hour students. And if you are watching this outside, it'd be great if you could press the like button, subscribe button. And if you want any information, if you've got any questions, then you simply put them in the box below. And our website is in the description below this if you want to put anything else we've got available. Well, that's all for now. Thank you from myself and Yoga Dharma.